The NFC North. Talk about what you need to know for fantasy for 2021 for this division. So we're going to go through each team, talk about the players on there and what we're looking for, the average draft position, whether or not it's right or wrong. So in general, first we'll start with, these are kind of general rules. You can skip a couple minutes if you've watched the other videos with this stuff. But basically, as far as my general fantasy strategy goes, I think it's important to remember that you don't need to draft a tight end or quarterback. Like, obviously, some like ESPN, I think, makes you, but that shit is really, really unimportant, those one-off positions. And unless there's crazy value in the position at which you're drafting them, it's basically always better to just take more and more shots at the running backs and wide receivers, the positions that actually win you fantasy leagues, because you're just going to end up with a better team and better value on your roster. Running backs are just so wildly more important compared to everything else in fantasy because of the scarcity of them as relative to the other positions that you should be prioritizing. And while it does look nice, or a lot of times wide receiver will look really good on your roster, as the season wears on and running backs start to go down around the league, you realize pretty quickly how valuable getting those guys who are actually worthy of starting in those spots, and not just worthy of starting, but like winning you weeks from those spots, how important they are. The draft, this is not your final roster. You should never think of it as that. You should just be trying to get as many good players or positive shots at good players on your team so that throughout the year, whether it's through trades, whether it's, realizing who you can cut or who you cannot, you can end up with the best team, the best chance to win the league because you are not done when the draft is done, at least if you want to be good at fantasy football. Opportunity is king. You can talk about how good a player, or I can talk about how good I think a player is, but if the guy's not going to get any targets for whatever reason in the offense he plays in, then he ain't valuable in fantasy. And that's something to really, really remember with this, no matter how good you think a guy is. And targeted things that especially later in the draft, week one, right? You can take these rookies that are going to sit on the bench for 6 weeks, like regardless, and hope that they come into something. But a lot of times those guys hit the waiver wire or just end up wasting a roster spot the whole time anyway. But taking guys who are potentially going to start and or see a lot of offense in week one is a lot more valuable because quickly. And then if they are there, then you can work with that information. Or if they are bad and, it's nothing came of it, then you can move on quickly and you can find something else that might work. So that's kind of just general stuff I like to say as far as my fantasy football mindset. But let's go through the teams here. Chicago Bears up first. This is the offense, and we'll go through and talk about the individual players. But as a whole, this offense is not set up for a whole lot of success. Now, I don't think they're in the worst position in the world. You're not looking at like the Jets last year or something like that. But overall, their offensive line, not particularly good. Tevin Jenkins actually is probably going to miss some time at the beginning of the year. So who knows what they end up doing at tackle. Andy Dalton, listen, he's done okay before. He would do okay again if he was in a decent offense without a million injuries in front of him like the Cowboys last year. And unfortunately, it's definitely on the lower end this year. It's not the worst thing in the world, but it's not great. You do have Allen Robinson, Darnold Mooney, who are going to provide a floor. And Matt Nagy, for as much shit as he gets, which he kind of deserves, he's not that bad as an offensive coach. He's still going to do some things that create yardage. I mean, listen, he had games where the competent offense with Mitch Trubisky as his quarterback. Like, that's not something that comes easily. So I will have people remember that. And then obviously you have the big whole thing, as with a couple other teams around the league, of the rookie backup quarterback, this being Justin Fields, where if he comes in, you could be talking about a wild change in circumstance for a lot of the fantasy players on this team. Not something you can really predict or really know at all at this point, but that is something to keep in mind. So when you look at the individual positions, as far as, fantasy relevant guys, you're never, ever taking Andy Dalton and Justin Fields on a fantasy draft. Don't waste a roster spot on a backup quarterback. Is the thing with Justin Fields, and then with Andy Dalton, because he's unstartable as compared to, however many other quarterbacks in the league that are going to actually play week one. At running back, David Montgomery. So David Montgomery, his ceiling is definitely limited. He's never going to get into the wild, top 5 or whatever, the running back position, because he's just not good enough. He's not fast enough, and he doesn't play in a good enough offense, right? Which is limiting. But I will say the dude showed last year that he's pretty decent as a running back. He's going to score touchdowns given, enough opportunities in the red zone area. And he's going to get a bunch of opportunities in this offense. Now, I will say I don't think it's quite as many opportunities as is expected, because they do bring in Damien Williams, former starter, could have been Super Bowl MVP on the Chiefs. And while I don't expect him to take the starting job or anything, People underrated him for a long time, and while I don't think he's like all that good, he's not bad, and he offers something way, way different than David Montgomery does to this team, which is a guy who can run fast. So that's something I will say to keep in mind, that it wouldn't surprise me if Damien Williams eats into his target, like his carries at least a little bit compared to last year. And they do still have Tariq Cohen on the roster. I'm not a Tariq Cohen fan at all. Really just belongs on special teams. But Matt Nagy's shown that he's willing to work him into an offense. So you're still talking about with David Montgomery, a guy who's not going to get very many receptions, if like any at all. And while he's going to get carries, they're not going to be on this great team or always like about to score a touchdown, that type of thing. So he's a running back who's going to get value, which is valuable, but he's not quite at the elite tier, or even where he's getting drafted, like at the beginning of the third round. That might be even a little high for him at receiver. So Allen Robinson, I don't need to speak too much to him. He's pretty widely known as a fantasy commodity. It's kind of the same thing he has been since he got to the Bears, as far as a guy who's going to get a bunch of targets. He's going to be like do pretty good with them. But again, without playing in a really good offense or having an upgraded quarterback, his ceiling is pretty capped as far as like top 3 at the position or something like that goes. But, you don't always expect or want that necessarily, depending on when you're drafting these guys. With Allen Robinson in the third round, is wide receiver 1 if you take 2 running backs. That's not bad. He's a guy who's going to be, again, he's going to catch probably double-digit touchdowns. And he's going to get a bunch of targets week to week. And, with the whole idea of how important volume is in fantasy, still super relevant. Darnold Mooney. So Darnold Mooney is really, really good. And I know he's gotten quite a bit of hype at this point going to the year, and there's a reason for that. However, I will say I don't expect anything crazy out of him this year, mostly because you are, again, talking about an offense with a bad offensive line led by Andy Dalton. And that's enough for me to think, you're not going to get 2 super productive fantasy receivers pretty much guaranteed. And while Darnell Mooney is really good, he's not necessarily a guy who you're looking at and is going to score like a bunch of touchdowns or something like that, which is where the real crazy fantasy stuff happens, right? So, he is valuable and he is good. And as a 10th round pick, you could do a whole lot worse. I don't think he actually has the like super high ceiling that some people say he does. Cause what is this little number 2 receiver on a bad offense going to get 120 targets and score, 8+ touchdowns with them? I guess it's possible because he's talented, but it's exceedingly unlikely. So I will be, don't think you're going to depend on him. At tight end, there's nothing here fantasy wise. Jimmy Graham's still okay. He's still going to score touchdowns, but you can't play him because you're just guessing or hoping that he's going to score a touchdown. And Cole Kmet is going to eat enough into his on-field presence for whatever reason. Cole Kmet's fucking garbage, but that hurts it even worse. And looking at their schedule, it's not like they play a bunch of easy defenses. You do catch the the Bengals have a fine defense. So you do catch like the Raiders, maybe the Packers at that point. We'll see what happens, but it's not something that you're looking at and saying, despite how bad some things might look, they're going to be able to take advantage of bad teams playing against them. Not really the case here. So yikes, kind of on the Bears. Detroit Lions next. So this is their offense. And the first thing to notice and the first thing to remind yourself, because everybody's saying, right, that the Detroit Lions are going to be like one of the 2 or 3 worst teams in football. And there's a lot of reasons for that. It's not necessarily something I disagree with. But 2 things to keep in mind. One, somebody on this team is going to have fantasy value. That's pretty much guaranteed. That happens every year on every team. Somebody's going to be worth starting at least in a part of the year. And 2, this team has a pretty damn good offensive line, like top tier in the NFL. And so for as bad as I think they're going to be in the wins column, having a really good offensive line means that they have a chance any given offensive possession to be competitive. And that's going to lead to yardage, and occasionally it is going to lead to touchdowns. It's just when you have a competent-ish offense in the NFL, that's what happens. So this isn't a team that's just screwed, right, offensively. So talking about the individual, skill position players, what we're looking at. So Jared Goff, not a guy, no way in fantasy. He's just a really bad quarterback. And again, despite the offensive line being good, it's not like he's playing in the system that's going to boost his ability. And he's just not good enough to make up for this stuff around the edges. At running back, however, Deandre Swift, He was a little bit of a disappointment as a rookie last year, but he is one of these guys who could get enough carries to like really, 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 or not just carries, to touches in his offense to be really, really relevant. Jamal Williams, while is a very good backup, actually, I think he's pretty underrated himself. He's not somebody who's ever going to take the starting job from DeAndre Swift. So, and he's not going to be like a huge, like receiver type guy, despite him being pretty underrated at that. Actually, he's okay at it, but regardless, he's not better than DeAndre Swift is the point. So Swift is going to be a guy who's probably going to see a lot of targets, is going to be leaned on because this team can't lean on Jared Goff, and is going to be running behind a pretty good offensive line. So at least while they're competitive in games, which again, fully healthy, they're probably talented enough to be, they're not going to get like blown out by 30 points every game. He's going to have some real production. And there's always the chance, obviously, that they do run into a string of teams, with injured quarterbacks, something like that, where they're even better. And if this team is in a position of leading, then DeAndre Swift, I think, all of a sudden gets really valuable. So, yeah, I'm a big fan of his in the third round, too, even. I'm definitely good with that. Jamal Williams is a backup, too. I mean, if something were to happen to Swift as far as an injury goes, he would step into the same situation effectively. Not quite as talented, but not such a catastrophic difference that I would get worried about it. And even as a guy who has standalone value, I mean, he's never someone you want to start, but it's not like impossible that he would give you, 10 carries a game or something like that and score a touchdown. Not that that's super valuable, but yeah. At receiver, so this is the downfall of this team, very likely, especially offensively. Because despite all the other stuff I talked about, if you don't have guys that are winning down the field, you're going to suck most of the time, which especially over the course of like a full game. And that's the problem here. I only have 2 guys listed just because it's the number 1 receiver theoretically and the only guy who's even getting drafted. But if you look at their depth chart, I mean, Tyra Williams is horrible. Jesus Christ. I can't imagine he's just on the field enough because of how not talented he is to be fantasy relevant. Quintez Siva is kind of, he's a lot better, but he's the same thing where there's no ceiling to him at all. Amon-Ra St. Brown, I guess, he's a rookie, so there's always maybe he's really good. But even if he is kind of good, the likelihood of him being like a valuable receiver here is not high. And Brashad Perriman, clearly the best receiver on this team, but not somebody who's going to demand a lot of targets, at which point you're talking about you hope he scores touchdowns. And with this team, is this going to be offense that's going out there scoring a bunch of touchdowns? No. So while theoretically someone could step into a huge target, it would have to be Amon-Ra St. Brown, just because he's the only one who we don't know can't do that. It's not something you're ever expecting or drafting for. TJ Hockenson, though, I will say, if anyone's a safe bet for volume or efficiency, not efficiency or production on this offense, it is him. He's a tight end who is going to be on the field pretty much 100% of the time. I'm not a huge fan of him as a player, but he's definitely not bad. He's more than serviceable. And theoretically, since he's going to be the best receiving option on this team, it's not going to be bad. And he's the type of guy where with this good offensive line and how athletic he is, he's going to end up, whether it's blown coverages or just running faster than a slow linebacker who's trying to cover him, like with some big plays occasionally. Now he's still in this big, whole thing of tight ends where he's just not going to be consistently week to week very good, especially again with this offense. But actually, as far as volume goes, he can be kind of up there. So, well, I don't think this, anyone outside of like Travis Kelce at the very top, maybe Darren Waller and George Kittle, anyone in any of the tiers after that, I don't think is necessarily worth drafting because, again, the opportunity cost of drafting TJ Hockenson in the 5th round is a receiver who's like a clear starter with the potential to be really good, somebody like a Tyler Lockett or something like that. And that's never worth it. But if TJ Hockenson does drop a little bit, I start to understand at least why he would be interesting. He's not someone I think is completely unjustified as being that high. Schedule-wise, too, that doesn't really do them any favors defensively. Those first 5 weeks, that's just really tough. Maybe they could compete with the Packers a little bit, but like it doesn't really look good. It gets a little bit easier after that, Bengals, Eagles, stuff like that. But it's really nothing that you're excited about. So that doesn't really help anything we've talked about. The last team in the NFC North here, second to last, the Packers, Green Bay Packers. So looking at their offense, I talked about this in my actual team preview for them for 2021. They're still going to be so good and so efficient. They're going to kill a lot of teams offensively, which is going to lead to big fantasy production especially with touchdowns. You have Aaron Rodgers at the top, who's amazing as far as I'm concerned. He is, by a very small amount, the best quarterback in the NFL. Aaron Jones is still an elite player. Devonta Adams is the best receiver in football. And I really think, anytime I get the chance to talk about this, I will. The addition of Randall Cobb is really more important than people want to admit. Randall Cobb is still pretty goddamn good. He's still talented. He's been very good both on the Cowboys and on the Texans. He's not like an elite player or anything. He never was, but that's not the point. He's a player who's super useful, wins in a lot of areas of the field that the Packers struggled to win at, as far as, underneath, between 0 and like 12 yards, because they were leaning on guys like Robert Tonyan, who, well, he does have some strengths. That's like winning and being open isn't one of them. But then it's like Alan Lazard is like kind of whatever outside receiver, and just a lot of bad stuff there. Randall Cobb turns that on his head, which is big for the offense as a whole, because this is already an offense that makes things pretty easy, and Aaron Rodgers is a quarterback who makes things very easy on himself. And then you just add another layer onto that. So any given play, any given possession, it's really hard to see ways for a defense to win with any level of consistency as long as Aaron Rodgers is out there. So that's why this quarterback 6 thing, average, that's ridiculous. As far as I'm concerned, you could argue for him being the first quarterback drafted, and I would have literally zero problem with it. My only concern is that the offense might be too good, which sounds wild, but they could be beating some teams by enough that they're just going to kind of lean into running the ball. This isn't a team that has a huge passing volume sometimes. And historically, I mean, Rodgers, again, it's not like he's this yardage monster necessarily the way that a Patrick Mahomes has been since he's entered the NFL. But regardless of that stuff, I mean, again, I think you're talking about a guy who could throw like literally 50 touchdowns. And if you draft him as your first quarterback, I have pretty much zero problem with it. Running back 2, Aaron Jones, I think is underdrafted himself. I mean, listen, I understand that people like A.J. Dillon, but we've literally seen Aaron Jones in a committee, or in a backfield that's splitting carries kind of with Jamal Williams, guy in the Lions, be wildly productive and finish the year as like the running back 2 in fantasy, I believe, just a couple years ago. And it's because he's on the super efficient offense. He's extremely talented, and their offensive line is still pretty goddamn good. Even with David Bakhtiari missing potentially the beginning of the year, the signing of Dennis Kelly is one of the most underrated and crazy good signings of the offseason. A more than capable, talented starting tackle that's going to be able to step in and not see a whole lot of difference compared to what would have happened. Like, yeah, Aaron Jones, super underrated, a guy I would love to have on my team for this year. And then A.J. Dillon, too, frankly. I mean, this team is good enough that A.J. Dillon could get quite a few carries as a not just pure backup, but like rotational running back, that he could see some production himself. Now, he's a lot more hit or miss week to week, and there's a lot more danger in that. But as both a guy who could see a couple weeks for multiple touchdowns and who would go crazy if Aaron Jones got hurt, as basically the only other relevant running back in that backfield. Although I will say they do have Kylan Hill, a guy who's been very good in the preseason, so we'll see about that. But A.J. Dillon there, really valuable. Another handcuffs you can get later that I think kind of do end up doing the same thing. You talk about Alexander Madison, Tony Pollard, guys who you're only starting them if the starter gets hurt anyway, so why waste an extra 4 rounds to get Dillon as opposed to one of them? But regardless, I do see the A.J. Dillon. And then Devonta Adams, receiver. Devonta Adams is amazing. Absolutely worth the wide receiver 1 in fantasy. He is the best receiver in football. He's open every play, effectively regardless of what the defense does. Aaron Rodgers loves throwing to him, is smart enough to realize that he can throw like 200 targets at him, and you don't really see diminishing returns. Like, he's that good, and he plays in that good of a situation. Whatever, if you draft him like 3rd overall, even after McCaffrey and Dalvin Cook, whatever, I get it. Past him, Randall Cobb is the end of the draft receiver I actually happen to be a gigantic fan of, because he's one of these guys that I mentioned at the beginning of the video where you're going to know really quick into the season if he's featured in this offense pretty heavily, which he should be. I think there's a really good chance that he should be. He should be their starting slot receiver, see consistent targets out of the slot, the way that this team runs offense, and be really valuable because he's going to be open in areas, again, that this team has kind of struggled with at times before. And well, it's not guaranteed. And like I said, if he comes out week one, is splitting, time on the field with Amari Rodgers and Allen Lazard, then whatever, you can drop him and figure something else out. But I really think there's a chance he's like a 10-plus catch guy for multiple weeks in the first 4 or 5 weeks of the season. And as a late round draft pick, that's like perfect as far as I'm concerned. Is there any other receivers worth drafting, despite how good I said this offense will be? Not necessarily. Lazard is the one. Right now, not normally getting drafted, but he is the third most talented receiver on this roster, and is hopefully going to full-time move ahead of Marquez Valdes-Scantling this year if the Packers are smart, which generally they are. And he could see the benefits of that, but touchdowns are going to be so heavily focused on Aaron Jones and Devonta Adams that I would get worried about that. And also on Robert Tonyan. So, he caught a ton of touchdowns last year. And while I'm not a big fan of his as a player, I don't think there's a meaningful difference between him and a lot of the other tight ends around the NFL. He still plays, that's for like real life in fantasy. He still plays on the Packers, is going to be on the field all the time. And has just as good a chance as he did last year to catch a bunch of touchdowns, which as far as tight ends go, outside of the top three, that's really all you can ask for. So while I don't really like drafting tight end in the 8th round, that is kind of the point of the draft where you start to be like, not really excited about the running back receiver prospects you could get there anyway. So I will say it's not the worst thing in the world. Schedule wise too, outside of the Bengals in week 4 and the Bears in week 6, those first 6 weeks aren't exactly crazy defenses or defenses I'm worried about Aaron Rodgers being able to handle. Then you catch the football teams could be a little tough, and maybe the Vikings, but like overall, this schedule actually of all the NFC North teams is like kind of the one you want, and it happens to line up with the best teams. So there's a lot of fantasy value on the Packers for this year. So the last team in the NFC North, Minnesota Vikings. Looking at the roster, this is a team that has maybe the best skill positions in the entirety of the NFL. And it has an offensive line that, while still overall, in the grand scheme of the NFL is not good, is not quite the horrible, wild disaster potentially that it has been at times before that's really limited this offense. We'll see if they do end up starting Dakota Dozier still at guard. Because if that's the case, then you can maybe amend what I just said to say they're still going to be that bad. But they've shown, literally last year they were top 10 offense, maybe even top 5 off the top of my head, with like playing through a horrible, horrible offensive line. So the floor on this team is really, really high. And again, with how good these players are, man, you could be looking at something really special, especially with how much better their defense is going to be this year, where they're not going to be forced into throwing the ball so much. Now, that could hurt their overall numbers, I suppose. That's true. But not something I'm crazy worried about. And I think it could let them do a lot more things freely on the offensive end, which could look even better than it has at times before. So the individual players, quarterback Kirk Cousins, I think if you're at the end of your draft and you've kind of done what I said, not really bother drafting a quarterback, he could easily come out and give you a, top 10 start to the season at quarterback, if not better, given how good this offense is. Overall, is he a season-long starter? I really, really don't think so, because this team is good enough and has shown the willingness to blow out teams. And when they do that, they will actually only throw the ball like 12 to 15 times as opposed to other teams, which is something to be concerned about why I don't like him as a full season starter. But at quarterback, you should only be looking at the first like 3-4 weeks anyway, where he's more than fine. At running back, Dalvin Cook. Yeah, running back too. That's definitely where he is for me as well, right behind Christian McCaffrey. Only difference is the receiving volume, but clearly the second best, like tied basically for the best running back in all of football, talent-wise, and is going to be in a place where he's going to get a bunch of really good, valuable carries and receptions on a good offense. Alexander Madison, same thing he has been the last couple of years. Overall, doesn't have any individual value, but if Dalvin Cook goes down, he will step in, be very, very productive. We did see last year that it wasn't exactly – he didn't hit the heights when Dalvin Cook was out those couple of games that people hoped he would, but they played some really tough defenses during that time. There's kind of some other circumstances going around with that, given how bad their defense was too, that I'm nowhere near as worried about this year. So he still has, as far as I'm concerned, the league-winning upside as a running back in the 10th or later round who could step in and be a top 6 guy for sure. At receiver, Justin Jefferson, Adam Thielen. I will say, for as much as I like this offense, now positively I'm talking about them, Justin Jefferson is getting drafted just a little bit high as far as I'm concerned. I think the guy's awesome. He's an amazing receiver. He's super, super talented. one of the best guys in the NFL. But volume-wise, I don't know if this team is really going to support two like crazy productive receivers the way they did last year. Like I mentioned earlier, their defense is so much better. They're not going to have to air the ball out the same way, and they've shown that they don't really want to if they don't have to. And for as good as Justin Jefferson is, Adam Thielen is still on this team. Adam Thielen is still really good. In any given year, at this point, there's still a chance that their targets get closer than it was last year. Not like a guarantee or anything. Wasn't Justin Jefferson still amazing? He's still a top like 10, 12 receiver for me for sure. So it's not like it's that big of a deal. But I will just say that about Justin Jefferson. I don't know that he quite has the ceiling. He does obviously given last year, but like the chance to hit that ceiling, I think is smaller compared to a lot of guys he's getting drafted around. Adam Thielen, though, I think there's a lot of value in him because, he caught like 12 touchdowns last year. He could easily do that again. He's still very, very good and playing on the same offense that he was on last year. And so while the same concerns that I said about Jefferson apply to him, you're talking about 2.5, 3 rounds later, it starts to look a lot better. And then Irv Smith Jr., again, you could be talking about a guy. So talent-wise, he's as good as you're going to get outside of George Kittle and Travis Kelce. He's every bit, as far as I'm concerned, as good as, maybe not quite as good as Darren Waller, but he's very close. Dallas Goddard, these other like super elite tight ends. Like he's exceedingly talented. My issue with him is just that, the volume is already so heavily invested in those top two running backs or top two wide receivers and Dalvin Cook. Kind of dries up for that position, and he would still be fantasy-wise because of that pretty touchdown dependent. And while the touchdowns could easily be there, like Irv Smith could catch 12 touchdowns next year, 10 touchdowns next year, and I don't think it would be surprising at all. That's not like a very likely thing, I will mention. So I like him as far as a chance at a late tight end who could end up in the top 3 to 5. Like, yeah, for sure, but he's not like crazy exciting because I don't think he's going to get the 100 targets or whatever that he needs to guarantee that high of a finish. Schedule wise though, I will say, they're kind of helped too. Like while those games can be tough to win at times, it's not like they're playing any intimidating defenses really. Like there's some decent ones. Bengals are okay. Browns are okay. Ravens are, pretty okay, pretty good maybe in the first half of the schedule, but that's it. And none of those are exactly terrifying, especially for the way this team plays. And while it gets a little tougher in the back half, still, it's not that crazy. So, Vikings, I'm all in on them as a team this year, and that's going to result in their fantasy guys being really valuable too. So that's the NFC North for 2021.